Okay, feel free to grab something to drink, something to eat. We're going to be starting their source sheets over here in the corner. And the topic for today's shir is the halachic status of Ethiopian Jews. And I was deliberate in my wording of the topic, but first I want to recognize the sponsor for this evening's class, sponsored by Cindy and Eitan Siv in memory of Cindy's father, Yisrael Yosef ben Shmuel, whose yahrzeit is tonight. Okay, so may the Rosh Chodesh Adar Bet. Okay, so may the learning being done tonight be an aliyah for his neshama. I specifically phrased tonight's presentation as the halachic status of Ethiopian Jews because as we'll see, there's the halachic question, and then there's the self-identity question. In other words, these people who lived in Ethiopia identified as Jews, and really, from my perspective, you can't change that self-identity. They identify as Jews. So from their perspective, there's Jews. When it comes to halacha, there are specific criteria. There are specific metrics that are required in order for the halachic system to acknowledge or to declare somebody to be Jewish. So it's kind of working on two planes. The reason why this question came to be is because there was a community that practiced Judaism that identified as Jews in Ethiopia, and were looking to make aliyah based on their Jewish identity. And that itself is an interesting question, the difference between Jewish identity as a criteria for aliyah from the perspective of the bureaucratic process that bestows Israeli citizenship based on Jewishness, right? Well, according to whom do you have to be Jewish in order to return under the law of return, or to return based to get Israeli citizenship based on your Jewish identity? And does that always match up to the halachic definition of a Jew? So we know that that's for sure, that's not the case, right? It's actually come into stark clarity surrounding the description of the incredible humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in the Ukraine. We just had a moment of Tehillim and words right after Mariv tonight. And whenever there's certainly lots of Jews in the Ukraine, right? The president's Jewish, the prime minister is Jewish. There's a lot of Jews in the Ukraine. How many Jews are there in the Ukraine? Right? So the most recent number that I've seen, especially in calls for action and calls for charitable giving, has been 400,000. But everyone agrees that that number is based on those that would have eligibility through the law of return, meaning 400 Ukrainians could prove a Jewish grandparent, right? That's how many halachic Jews are there in the Ukraine? Half that, quarter that, probably over 100,000, between 100,000 and 200,000 maybe. There's certainly, obviously, these are tremendous communities, but the fact that there's this pretty large disparity between the high estimate and other estimates indicates that Jewish identity finds expression in many ways. Some of them recognized by halacha, and others of which are not, but they're recognized for other purposes, like the law of return, like Israeli citizenship, like self-identification as a Jew. So if we're going to talk about this topic, it's important to understand that we're specifically talking about the question of the halachic status of this community that self-identified as Jewish, and where does that fit in? So, if tonight we're going to focus on a responsa of Rav Ovadia Yosef, perhaps the most important posek of the 20th century in Israel, and certainly a posek of stature across the Jewish world, but particularly and especially within the Sephardic community, because of his encouragement of relying on Sephardic poskim of previous generations that had been that had fallen by the wayside based on the analysis of other Ashkenazic poskim and judges that had made their way to Israel from parts of the Ashkenazic world. And Rav Ovadia Yosef felt very strongly that Sephardic psak and Sephardic rabbis and Sephardic methodology and Sephardic approaches to questions of the time need to be front and center in Israel especially, and that was a definite motivation of his in many of his psakim. It's arguable that his psak concerning the Ethiopian Jewish community is his ruling that had the most impact. It allowed for 100,000 Jews who currently reside, or more than 100,000 Jews of Ethiopian descent who live currently in Israel, to come to Israel and to be accepted by the halachic bureaucracy as Jewish. And what's interesting is not only Rav Ovadia's methodology in this case, but also his working assumptions. And there's a famous saying about the Dubna Magid, right? That sometimes he would tell a story, and the story would lead to the lesson. And sometimes he would have a lesson that he wanted to tell, and then he would tell a story that brought out that lesson, right? Which came first? And some people ask specifically about this psak of Rav Ovadia concerning Ethiopian Jewry, which came first, his analysis of the original texts, or his innate and values-based conviction that these communities, or this community in Ethiopia, should be recognized as Jewish. And then he went back to paint the sources as supporting it. Now, obviously, he could not make it up. There had to be some basis within the tradition. And what's very typical of a tshuva of Rav Ovadia Yosef, unlike, say, Rav Moshe Feinstein, is he will quote, his tshuvot are exceedingly long, because contained within it, and my source sheet quotes a number of other rabbis, but the entire quotes I got from the tshuva of Rav Ovadia. He was encyclopedic of that nature, and just quoting all of these sources. And so it'll be up for you to in some way to decide, did Rav Ovadia come to this conclusion based on the strength of the argument, or is there some sort of extra textual reasoning and agenda, not in a bad way, but an agenda that Rav Ovadia had that he wanted to come to this conclusion, and he worked to make the sources fit it to justify that conclusion. So, for instance, if you look at, just to give you contrast, there's a tshuva from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. It's the first source on the source sheet on page 1 from 1985, summer of 1985. Rav Moshe died Tanis Esther 1986. So it's right before Rav Moshe Feinstein died. The year before, it's a sheila sent in response to a question that his grandson had. And in that tshuva, he said, he was asking, the specific question was, is it okay to teach Ethiopians that have come to Israel, can you teach them Torah if we don't yet consider them Jewish? Right, so there's an assumption there, and a number of assumptions. One, that the Ethiopian Jews that came over were lacking conversion and needed conversion, and also that there's a sensitivity, which we know exists, of teaching Torah to non-Jews. And of course, that sensitivity, that concern is waived when a person is converting, because they can only convert to Judaism when they know something, and before they convert, they're not yet Jewish. But so that's the question. But in the context of that question, Rabbi Feinstein weighs in on the status, the halachic status of the Ethiopian community, and he says, "Ad shemitgairim ein lahachshivam l'maaseh kayudim b'adaim." They should not be considered to be full-fledged Jews. What does that mean? So they should not be counted as part of the minyan. They should not be given an aliyah to the Torah. And as he puts it, ein levaisham aval ein lachnifam. We shouldn't embarrass them because of their status that's less than Jewish, but neither should we gloss over it. Now we have to be real. We have to be honest about where we're at. And the honesty is such that we have to acknowledge that they're not quite Jews and that they need conversion. But the last line, Rabbi Feinstein points out, aval heim l'chumra mechuyavim l'shmor kol mitzvot me'achar she'ulai heim Yehudim. They're what we call in halachic literature a safek. Maybe they're not Jewish, so they need to engage in a process of learning that would culminate in conversion, right? With going to the mikveh, etc. But maybe they are Jewish, right? So because they might be Jewish, right, they have to keep all the mitzvot. So on a personal level, they have to keep all the mitzvot. Communally, we can't count them for a minyan, right? So they have to daven, but they can't count for a minyan. Right? Sort of this in-between state. Now, obviously, we're not going to make them stay in limbo, according to Rabbi Feinstein. When they are educated, when they have the knowledge, and we'll see exactly what knowledge were the Ethiopian Jewish community lacking. But Moshe says after that process, they can become Jews, but even before they convert, they are in the status of safek. In English, nishtaheh, nishtaheh, right? They're not Gentiles. They have to keep mitzvot, but they're not Jewish. They can't count for a minyan. Vis-a-vis themselves, they have to consider themselves Jewish and keep all the mitzvot. Vis-a-vis their communal standing, you cannot marry them to another Jew. They can't count for a minyan, etc. Rav Ovadia Yosef disagrees with this. Rav Ovadia Yosef feels that the Ethiopian community that identified as Jewish from Ethiopia are fully Jewish Yehudim Gemurim, right? Now, again, Rabbi Feinstein admits that they might be Jewish. Since they might not be, they're going to engage in a process of conversion. Rav Ovadia says, no, for sure they're Jewish. They don't need any process of conversion, even due to a safek. There's not even a possibility that they're not Jewish. Why? He hangs his hat on the great Sephardic rabbi, the Radvaz, right? And I'll read a piece. The second source has a piece from a tshuva that is quoted by Rav Ovadia. Shakol elu hatabi shish, habaim eretz Kush. Right? All of those people from this tribe, from Kush, right? From Africa, heim yeshevet Dan bli safek. Right? They're from the Shevet of Dan. Without a doubt, says the Radvaz. Right? The Radvaz lived about 500 years ago or so. He says they're for sure from the tribe. They're for sure from the tribe of Dan, right? So, and he explains a little bit in terms of what was the issue. Excuse me. They shelo hayu b'yameim chachamim b'alei Kabbalah. You know what these Jews for all those centuries were lacking? The living rabbinic tradition of Judaism. They didn't have b'alei Kabbalah, not Kabbalah like Kabbalists, but Kabbalah like the Masorah. The rabbinic tradition, the oral tradition, Torah Shebaal Peh, that accompanies and interprets and explains the written Torah. So because they were lacking this element, right? They were exiled before the Mishnah, certainly before the Gemara. Right? They missed out on all of these eruditions, commentaries, that which gives us the living, breathing, active Judaism that we practice. They're missing that, and what do they have? Tafsu lahem pshatei ktuvim. All they had was the text of the Bible itself, and as such, they acted in many ways like what the Karaites are accused of doing. Right? They acted based on the Torah shebichtav, purely on the biblical text. Aval im hayu malamdin otam lahayu kofrim kedat hakarayim shem sadaku baitus. Right? They say that Radva says there's a fundamental difference between an Ethiopian Jew and, say, a Karaite. Karaites denied fundamental principles of Jewish faith, like reward in the afterworld, right? Tzadok and Baitus. So they're better off. They believe in everything they know to be Jewish. They're just lacking a very large, important chunk of what it means to be Jewish, subsequent to the exile. Radva says they're fully Jewish, but they're like a tinok shenishba, and this comes up. We talked about that last summer, right? People who do not observe mitzvot. What status do they have? The Talmud talks about people like that as being rebellious, right? And in some way, we have to shun them. We have to sort of push them out of the community, right? There's some very severe repercussions of a person who does not observe that does so out of rebellion. But there's the creation of a category called tinok shenishba. Tinok shenishba literally means a infant, a toddler, a child that was captured. Right? Think about a child that was hidden in a monastery and grew up as a Christian and never knew that he or she was Jewish. Right? Do we feel that their non-observance is somehow a rebellion against the faith? Of course not. They don't know better. And that's what the Radva says is the category of an Ethiopian Jew, fully Jewish. We trace them back to Shevet Dan, and historically they'll explain that they were both forced and chose to remain separate from all the other religions and faith communities. There were Muslims, there were Christians, but they remained separate. And that decision and force that they were forced to remain separate is what the Radvaz is relying on to say that they are fully Jewish. I just want us to understand, even before we get into it carefully, that you might think that declaring the Ethiopian community fully Jewish is the right thing to do and is the respectful and the responsible thing to do. It's the way that we treat them with dignity and with Avat Yisrael. But just to throw a monkey wrench in that calculation, if they are to be Jews, if they're fully Jewish, but they did not have the rabbinic system, even let's say of divorce and marriage. So what you've created is a scenario where you have Jews who were married and may not have gotten divorced according to halacha, got remarried, and created a situation of mamzerut, right? So what's better, to declare these Ethiopian Jews a Suffolk Jew and require them to convert? And once they convert, we don't care about their yichus. If we can declare them to be non-Jews and they undergo a process of conversion, then it doesn't matter whether their grandmother was divorced and remarried without a get. They're not Jew. They weren't Jewish, right? So which option is doing them a favor, right? That community. Is it the right thing to do to declare them Jewish? Is it the right thing to do to declare them not Jewish and require a conversion? Right now, again, the Radvaz presumably was not focused on, what's the right thing to do? What's the halachic thing to do? Right? Let the cards fall where they may. Right? We would suspect that the Radvaz, being that this was not necessarily such a relevant question the Radvaz was dealing with a question of one particular person, a man whose mother was an Ethiopian Jew, and her husband, and she was sold into slavery, and a Jew bought her as a slave, and it ends up that she had children from her first husband, and the word was that the first husband died, and so the master married the slave and had a child. That's the background. One case. So we wanted to know, is that child a mamzer because this woman was Jewish as an Ethiopian Jewess, and now she never got divorced, so what do you do with that, right? So the beginning is that the Radvaz holds that they are fully Jewish. And Rav Avadia Yosef says that we should rely on that. right? If you look at the first Rav Avadia, Ata harei taladat, quoting pasuk we say in Tefillah, Shayudim hafalashim, dinam ki Yisrael l'chol davar, ve'inam tzrichim tefillah l'chachnis b'kal Hashem. Right? They are fully Jewish, and there's no need to convert them, even even to remove a doubt. Right? Rav Yosef says there's a great assumption based on law, precedent that is set that the Jews of Ethiopia, that the community of Ethiopian Jews are Jews, according to halacha, and we're not going to second guess that, even to say, oh, maybe we should convert them as a doubt, a gir l'chumra. No, says Rav Avadia, they're fully Jewish. And then Rav Avadia says, because of this, I'm just paraphrasing that next paragraph. On the Rav Avadia, he says, I sent a letter to the Sochnut, to the Jewish Agency, and all the government organizations that deal with absorption and deal with aliyah, and told them to allow the Ethiopian Jewish community to make aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and not to allow them to remain exiled and dispersed in the continent of Africa. And they'll come to Jewish schools, and they'll learn those large tracts of area of Jewish life and living that they were never exposed to in their homeland, but they're fully Jewish. And Rav Avadia says, the Radvaz, the holy Radvaz, the great Sephardic Posek Radvaz holds that they're Jewish. That's how I'm going to hold, 100%. No doubt about it. And we see that the Ashkenazic poskim were a little bit more reticent, right? Not to go, again, they tread lightly. They don't say that they're for sure not Jewish, but they're also not comfortable saying that they're for sure Jewish the way Rav Avadia is adamant to do so. He says, for sure, don't convert them, right? They're for sure Jewish. Why? Chazaka gedolah, we rely on the Radvaz. Tzitz Eliezer, quoted in Rav Avadia's Tshuva, says, it's not so clear that we can rely on this. The Jewish community in Ethiopia, who were descendants of Dan, who may have been fully Jewish, they lived in an area of great strife, many battles, many wars. There was often, almost every day, there were women and children, especially, being captured, being taken, being married by the victors, right? And as such, there could have been these intermarriages. It was happening all the time, right? As he quotes in the second to last line of that Tzitz Eliezer, Chol Yom Shovim Elu Me'elu. Right? Every day they were kidnapping one and the other. Haresh Katav Shekito Tanotzim Ishmelim Israelim Shovim Elu Me'elu Liotze Sheyesh Bein Afalashim Taruvot Me'umot Acherot. It's very nice that the Radvaz says that there is a community of Jews living in Ethiopia that are originally from the Shevet of Dan. But don't deny, the Radvaz also says, the Tzitz Eliezer, Eliezer Waldenberg, a contemporary of Rav Avadia, Ashkenazic Posek, living in Israel as well. Tzitz Eliezer says, don't deny the fact that the Radvaz himself says that they lived in a very dangerous, unsettled place where the possibility of these back and forth and perhaps intermarriage was very real. Yeah, Mark.
Did he not realize that they were wrong and say
Well, yeah, but that doesn't help this, right? That doesn't change that. No, well, because the question really that the Tzitz Eliezer asks is, how can Rav Avadia be so sure that from the time of the Radvaz, even if you want to say that the Radvaz was sure that in his time the Jews of Ethiopia were intact, what about the subsequent 500 years leading up to the 20th century? That's the real question. Of course, there have been cases of that, but first of all, it wasn't B'chol Yom. There was nowhere that this happened every day, and when it did happen, there was a clear was a clear record of it. The way that Tzitz Eliezer, again, he may be misinterpreting the historicity of that age. We don't know. You need to go back in time. But he's saying that there was so much going on back then, and I would say in the elapse of 500 years, we don't really know what happened. And as such, we're in a place that the Tzitz Eliezer says, even according to the Radvaz, are you so sure that he would be comfortable in the 21st century, in the 20th century, of declaring this entire community to be Jewish without any need for what we call Giur l'chumra, to at least acknowledge the possibility of something that went that muddled the lineage and the yichus of this. So Rav Ovadia says, right? If the Radvaz was worried about this, then the Radvaz should have said something like that. In other words, the Radvaz raises the issue that this was a problem. But he also says in a different tshuva that you can rely on this community to be fully Jewish. So says Rav Ovadia, if the Radvaz was worried about it, then the Radvaz should have said something. The fact that he doesn't say something, right, and that's also always a question. From the absence of a statement, what can we learn from it? Right? And Rav Ovadia wants to say that the Radvaz was a smart man, worthy of being relied on, absolutely. And he was aware of the political military situation, and he doesn't raise that as a problem. So who are we to raise that as a problem, right? So again, he's being extraordinarily deferential to the Radvaz, and saying that there's a strong chazaka presumption that cannot be removed just by speculation, like the Tzitz Eliezer is offering. And so he remains resolute and firm in this position. The Tzitz Eliezer, the Rav Ovadia also goes on to say that today, that the psak of the Radvaz has the status of like two witnesses. The gold standard of confirming a reality is two witnesses, right? Even if they're wrong, right? Two witnesses say something that's fact for halachic purposes. Rav Ovadia says the fact that the Radvaz weighed in on this and said this is the halacha, it's like two witnesses declaring that this community is fully Jewish. So who are you to bring up speculation? The Tzitz Eliezer talks about genetic testing that led, and again, this made people very uncomfortable in terms of, was there a racial, racist element to this questioning? But Rav Ovadia says, without getting into sort of the underlying motivations, Rav Ovadia says it doesn't matter. All of this is secondary. The Radvaz has created a truth, and that truth cannot be undone, namely that the Ethiopian Jewish community is halakhically Jewish, unless you bring proof of the same level to the contrary. And no one has done so. Neither the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Woldenberg, neither Rav Moshe Feinstein. And so Rav Ovadia is being very firm in his position. If you turn the page over to the second side of the source sheet, this is all these quotes are from that tshuva of Rav Ovadia Yosef. He quotes a letter from Rav Moshe Feinstein that did not, as far as I could tell, certainly not in the first 8 volumes of Igros Moshe, did not make it into the books that we have of Rabbi Feinstein's Responsa. He refers to this letter in the letter that I quoted, in the Responsa that I quoted to you from Yoredea Chelek Daled. But in this letter, it's not a direct quote, it's hearsay. It's what Rav Ovadia heard was in this letter from Rabbi Feinstein. Let's read it inside. Gam halom shamati. Shagon Rabbi Moshe Feinstein Shlita Katav Michtav Rav Mordechai Tendler B'Yom Chav Zayin Sivan Tashim Mem Daled, summer of 84, a year before the summer of 85 letter that we saw. Shaf Sharadvaz Katav She'ein Safek Shaf Halashim Yehudim Yeshevet Dan. Right, even though the Radvaz writes that there's no doubt that these Ethiopian Jews are from the tribe of Dan and therefore considered halachically Jewish. Lidina kasher lismok al zeh. As a practical matter of halacha, Says Rabbi Feinstein, it's difficult to rely on this. Radvaz, kilo baror im haradvaz yodea heitev, and tametziot odotam. Right? We've talked about this before, that a psak is a posek needs to understand the halachic underpinnings of the situation at hand, and also the reality of the situation. Right? You have to understand whatever area of life it's dealing with, whether it's science or whether it's construction or whatever area of life it is. You have to understand the facts. If you can understand the facts, your psak is only as good as the facts that you were given. If the facts are incomplete or incorrect, then the conclusion that a posek reaches is questionable. So Rav Moshe says, did the Radvaz have his facts right? Did the Radvaz have his facts straight? And so, similar to what the Tzitz Eliezer said, are we sure that did the Radvaz have the full picture of what the situation was for this community? If he knew the real picture, would he be so confident that they not only originated from Shevet Dan, but they continue to be from the Shevet of Dan, and makes them all halachically Jewish? Rabbi Feinstein was much more reticent, much more doubtful, right? And even if he's willing to say that the Radvaz was right in the 15th, 16th century, who says he continues to be right until the 20th century, until 1973 or whatever, the middle of the 20th century? So that's the opposition to Rav Avadia's position, right? But Rav Avadia was resolute, and I would submit that is based on two motivations. Number one, the motivation of deference to the Radvaz. The great Radvaz should not be questioned. The great Radvaz is a chazaka gedola. The great Radvaz is like two witnesses testifying to the reality of their Jewishness halachically, and all these Ashkenazic later rabbis who are trying to throw cast doubt, it doesn't count. They're great, but it doesn't count. They don't stand up to the Radvaz. And the Radvaz there's a concept in the Talmud, Ein Safek, Moti Midei Vadai. Right? The Tzitz Eliezer says, maybe this happened, maybe that happened. Moshe Feinstein says, we don't know what happened in the last 400 or 500 years. Maybe this happened, maybe that happened. And Rav Avadia says, with all due respect, Ein Safek Moti Midei Vadai. You have maybes, and the Radvaz says, this is for sure. Right? And so what Rav Avadia basically says is, if it was good enough for the Radvaz, it's good enough for me. If the Radvaz was sure that they were Jewish, halakhically Jewish in his day, then I am sure that continues to be the case, that community is halakhically Jewish to my day, to the 20th century. So that was one. What one was his deference, excuse me, for the Radvaz. And the other thing was that he was, in terms of Sephardic psak, wanting to put that at the forefront and give more credence and seriousness to this position. But there also seems to be this agenda that the Jews of Ethiopia should be able to come to this country, to become to the Jewish state. They suffered as an outside community in their country of origin. They've wanted for this, they sacrificed for this. They should be allowed to come in, and we have the holy Radvaz upon which to rely. Last point, and that is that what I mentioned earlier, that making, like, what's the bigger favor for this community? For them to be Jewish or for them not to be Jewish? If they're not Jewish, they have to undergo the process of conversion, and their identity has been questioned, which is hard, right? You think you're Jewish, and you find out that the state of Israel, the Jewish state, does not accept you as Jewish. We can't we can't say that that's not hard, but it's repairable, right? You repair it through conversion, right? You may not be Jewish halachically now, but after a process of conversion, you will be, right? So it's definitely it definitely might be hard, but it's certainly repairable. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the Radvaz's consideration. He's looking at what he believes to be the truth. But I can't help but wonder if Ravaja was looking at it from the perspective of the state of Israel, welcoming Jews, Jews of all stripes and all colors, and that would not play a role. And the great Radvaza says that they're Jewish. But on the other hand, if they're Jewish, do we have to worry that there's mamzerim, that somebody got married and divorced without a Jewish divorce, and now they got remarried and have children, and those children are mamzerim. So they don't need conversion. They're Jewish, but they're mamzerim. That's even harder. Convert can't marry a Kohen, but a mamzer can't marry anyone, right? So that's complicated. So look what the Radvaz says. The second side. Avalini and Yuchsin, ani choshe shema kiddushin v'gitam enon kitikun chazal. Sharei enam yodim v'tiv gidin v'kiddushin. Radvaz says, yeah, it's a problem. Radvaz says, and again, because remember, Radvaz was talking about one person, right? And in that test case, right? It was a man, right? Remember the case, right? So yay, we say he's Jewish. That's great. Yeah, but the Radvaz says, yeah, but he's a mamzer. It's not so great, right? So the Radvaz, that's how from the Radvaz perspective, that's where he leaves it. Rav Ovadia, it's interesting. When it came to declaring the Ethiopians halachically Jewish, Rav Ovadia says, don't mess with the Radvaz. The Radvaz is the be-all, end-all, right? Nobody lay a finger on the Radvaz. Nobody matches up to the Radvaz. He's chazakah gedolah. He's two witnesses, and no one can challenge him. When it comes, okay, so they're Jewish. So they don't need conversion. Can they marry anyone? Are they mom? Is there a problem on Zeris? Radvaz said, yes, your holy Radvaz, Rav Ovadia Yosef, your Rebbe says that there's a problem. Radvaz says, not so fast. Hine, Rav Ovadia says, and I'll just translate while I go instead of reading it in Hebrew and English. He says, I investigated carefully and interviewed the rabbis of the Ethiopian community, their priests, their religious functionaries. And it became clear to me that in the Ethiopian community, there is no concept of kiddushin, of Jewish marriage, that would have any halachic significance. He goes into a long paragraph about how exactly there were family units, there were husbands and wives. But how exactly did that happen? Talks about how there were arranged marriages. The girl was about 12, 13 years old. They would live apart. A few days before the wedding, the family would bring in some gifts for the family. Would bring in some gifts to the kala, right, the bride, and they would live together, and that'd be it. So Rav Ovadia says there's nothing in those steps that can be construed as halachic kiddushin, right? There's no like the way we do it, right? The essence of halachic marriage today: give a ring, say the phrase, right? Give a ring, say the phrase. Netina and Amira. Says Rav Ovadia, I spoke at length with the rabbis of Ethiopia. That's not how marriages took place. There was no ring, there was no statement, there were no witnesses. None of the trappings of we understand to be halachic marriage existed, right? What was that? But it wasn't from the groom. It was the family, right? And there weren't any witnesses, and they didn't do it l'shem kiddushin, right? So what Rav Ovadia has done is they're fully Jewish. There was never a need. They could not have done gittin, because gittin, as we do it, is a rabbinic construct, but they didn't need it because they never did halachic weddings. So again, they were all living outside of matrimony. Those of us learning Yevamos know it's not a good thing, but it's not the end of the world, right? They were coupling without being halakhically married. But they didn't need a divorce in order to end those relationships. So that's what Ravaja says. What happened to the Radvaz? So when he needs the Radvaz, right, he uses the Radvaz, right? When the Radvaz is inconvenient, he finds a way. He says the Radvaz didn't know. Again, the Tzitz Eliezer and the Rav Moshe also said the Radvaz didn't know something. But no, he argues, and where he doesn't argue, he defends the Radvaz to the end. Just to the last line of Rav Avadia, right before the Rabbi Feinstein quote, "Baha salikna, baha nachitna," back and forth at the end of the day. Ethiopian. There's no reason to assume that there was any type of matrimony within the Ethiopian community. Mutar lavo b'kal Yisrael, lo shum giyur afilu chumra. Right? Fully Jewish, no concerns for, so no need for conversion when they get to the state of Israel, but also no need to worry about mamzerut, because there was never any concept of marriage that would have any halachic status. Interesting. By the way, Rabbi Feinstein reaches a similar conclusion about whether there would be need, because even Rabbi Feinstein says that they're Suffolk Jews, right? They might be Jewish, right? They have to treat themselves as if they're Jewish even before the conversion. And then after the conversion, everyone treats them as Jews. If they're possibly Jewish from the onset, what about mamzeros? Even a possible Jew, we have to worry about this status. So Rabbi Feinstein gives a different, Rabbi Feinstein comes to the same conclusion, right? Right? Because there was no kiddushin, he says, you don't have to worry about them marrying close relatives, because nobody does that, right? Unless you're a redneck, right? Nobody marries close relatives. Now, there are some relatives that are prohibited according to the Torah, right? Like a man's sister-in-law after his brother dies. If his brother had children, he's not allowed to marry his dead brother's wife, right? Even after he's dead, right? That's Esharach, right? So that, in other cultures, that might be something that happened. That's an erva that would create, if they had a child, that would create mamzeros. So Moshe comes to what Rav Avadia says. There was no concept of, which his grandson quoted to him, probably from Rav Avadia, that there was no concept of halachic kiddushin that existed within the practices, the norms, the culture of the Ethiopian community, and therefore there's nothing to worry about. So just to conclude, what we see here is a couple of things from Rav Avadia. Number one, the fact that he was stalwart in defense of the Ethiopian Jewish community to be considered fully Jewish, relying heavily on the Radvaz, and saying that the Radvaz, you can't ask questions on the Radvaz, except when you can't ask questions on the Radvaz, right? Can't ask questions on the Radvaz as it relates to their full 100% Jewish status without any need for conversion. If they're fully Jewish, maybe they are mamzerut involved, and now we have to be worried about their lineages, to which is in fact what the Radvaz decided when he was dealing with only one case of it. Ravaja Yosef was dealing with thousands of cases of it where this is a real issue, does a little bit of research, does not say what the Radvaz says has to be true 400 years later, does research, talks to the people on the ground, the priests and the rabbis of the community, finds out that there's a piston pen opening to say that there was never any halachic marriage, and therefore comes to this conclusion, fully Jewish, without any concern of mamzerut. And that was very important in terms of bringing the community over to Israel. Important to note that the Rabbanut, as a matter of policy, when an Ethiopian held like Rav Moshe Feinstein. In other words, from the optics, Rav Avadia was very important in terms of, again, and the Ethiopian Jewish community is subject to racism and a lot of challenges. But the fact that Rav Avadia went to the mat, let's say, for their Jewish status was very important. As a matter of practical halacha, the Rabbanut took the more stringent approach to require what we call giyur l'chumra. They undergo a conversion, usually at the time that they, at certain points in their life. For instance, if they're looking to get married, right? Before they get married, they'll undergo a giyur l'chumra, conversion, to remove all doubt. So Rav Avadia very interesting in terms of where he feels the Radvaz is cannot be questioned and where he's willing to question him. What his motivation is, when he seems to be, he felt very strongly that the Ethiopian Jewish community had to be accepted as full-fledged Jews, and where he was willing to argue with him. And again, is that because there was an agenda? We all have agendas. There seems to be an agenda on behalf of Klal Yisrael, an agenda on behalf of a community that had thrown their lot with the Jewish people, which is what we ask of converts to do, and we're looking to come to the Jewish homeland, and not only in terms for their purposes, because again, today the Rabbanut makes them convert, but from the optics of the Jewish community that was already in Israel, to what extent would they be accepted? And even if there was a long way to go now, you wonder if it has at least been mitigated and the process made a little bit easier as a result of the boldness and the courage of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, I just view the